Good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Jack Cafferty. This is CNN Hotline. For the next couple of hours, we'll give you the opportunity to talk to the experts and to our CNN correspondents in the field about the events of the last 5 days. The telephone number to call is a toll-free one. It's 800-310-4CNN. Aviation security and terrorism, the hotline topics of the moment, as you might expect. Over the next couple of hours, we will talk to Mary Schiavo, who left the FAA and has some rather harsh things to say about that agency. She's a former Department of Transportation Inspector General, and she wrote a best-selling book about the shortcomings of the airline industry called Flying Blind, Flying Safe. Also, terrorism expert Harvey Kushner, who has written a book called The Future of Terrorism, plus senior political analyst Jeff Greenfield, and all of our correspondents in the field. We have them at Ground Zero at an armory here in the city for the families of the victims, as well as in Washington, D.C. First, let's get all the latest news up to the minute on the investigation of the World Trade Center bombings from Pentagon and the Pentagon tragedies from our senior correspondent, Gary Cutley. Gary.
Thanks, Jack. Well, as we know, there's now a second person being held as a material witness in connection with Tuesday's attacks. The man had been held by U.S. immigration authorities, and he has been questioned by the FBI. The first material witness, that's someone who has believed to know something important about a crime, was arrested on Thursday. Every military operation has to have a name, it seems, and there's none yet for the war on terrorism, whatever that's going to be. But there is now for the military's current domestic effort following the attacks. It's being called Operation Noble Eagle. Like father, like son, President Bush's father went to Camp David to make his key decisions leading to the Gulf War 10 years ago. Now George W. Bush is there. Saturday he said, "We're at war," and he labeled Osama bin Laden as suspect number one on his list for the attacks on Tuesday. And in New York City, the digging, the searching, the hoping continues. But on Saturday, as on Friday, as on Thursday, no survivors were found. The number of people believed to be buried under that mountain of rubble has now been raised to nearly 5,000. Only 159 bodies have been recovered, and 187 people are missing and believed dead at the Pentagon site. And now, 4 days after the attacks, the funerals are beginning in New York City and elsewhere. Mourners gathered Saturday at the funerals of 3 top New York City Fire Department officials. There may be some 300 services for firefighters alone. Fire Department Chief Peter Gonsi, Department Chaplain Father Michael Judge, and First Deputy Fire Commissioner William Feehan all lost their lives on Tuesday while trying to carry out their rescue missions there. A lot more of that to come, unfortunately. A growing question now, of course, is when and how will the United States respond to the attacks? President Bush does not want to be held to any specific timetable. His officials Saturday are putting out the word saying that it will be a long-term struggle. Here's our David Ensor.
An angry and determined president is promising action.
We will find those who did it. We will smoke them out of their holes.
But if Osama bin Laden is the culprit, revenge against him or against his hosts, the Afghan Taliban government, will not be easy. Cruise missiles fired in 1998 missed bin Laden and may only have strengthened his image. Even if bin Laden is killed, many analysts say that would not stop terrorism by his followers.
I would want to destroy as much of bin Laden as possible. I'm simply saying that's like picking a wart off your neck or something. That doesn't do much. That's a very superficial blow against this kind of capability.
To get rid of one man or to launch any kind of revenge attack isn't going to help. Revenge alone is not an answer. There has to be a complete eradication and elimination of all the training camps.
But bombing alone would not likely achieve that. And there are indications those terrorist training camps in Afghanistan are today largely empty. Much of bin Laden's support is across the border in Pakistan, in the area around Peshawar. One reason the promise by Pakistani President Musharraf to help the U.S. against the terrorists could be crucial.
I especially want to thank the President and people of Pakistan for the support that they have offered and their willingness to assist us in whatever might be required in that part of the world as we determine who these perpetrators are.
But can Musharraf convince his military and intelligence services to stop their long and active support for the Taliban?
Pakistan is supplying fuel funding, infrastructure, training, arms, and administrative help to the Taliban. Without the Pakistani lifeline, the Taliban would not survive.
Senior administration officials warn none of this is going to be easy or quick, and that the United States cannot do it alone. It could, in fact, take years, analysts say, of political, economic, and military effort before Americans can overcome their newfound fear of mass terrorism on U.S. soil.
We're talking about a war, and it's a campaign. And in a campaign, there are going to be a lot of battles. We're going to win some of these battles. We're going to lose some of these battles. There are going to be more civilian casualties on both sides. More Americans will die.
Before it is over, many analysts say it could even require U.S. ground troops in the region. For now, though, the main focus of the Bush team is diplomatic, building a strong international coalition, much as the president's father did before the Gulf War. David Ensor, CNN, Washington.
There is, however, Jack, one major difference between now and 10 years ago. George Bush Sr. then had a very carefully, narrowly defined goal focused to hold that coalition together. This time, as we all know, and as the President acknowledges, it's a much broader agenda out there. So many targets you're looking at, it's going to be much more difficult to hold a coalition or alliance together.
And not only Osama bin Laden's group, but there are other terrorist groups. Bin Laden's active in 55 different countries, including the United States. Some of the people that are suspected in these crimes against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were living right here in the United States, going to flight school, learning how to fly these planes. So it's a much more far-reaching and probably tougher to define objective.
Much
had.
more difficult because there's no singular Saddam Hussein out there. Yeah. It's a network. Yeah. And how many heads do you have to cut off?
You've covered a few stories back down the road. You and I worked together over at NBC a few years back. What do you do with this story? Where do you rank it? How do you
this is the top.
Put this in the file?
I started my journalistic career, I think at 23, as an office assistant for NBC a week or two before JFK was assassinated. And in terms of impact, hitting the nation, this is up at that category.
Where were you? How did you find out about it?
I was in Brussels as an office assistant. It was the evening, and I got a phone call in my apartment from the wife of John Chancellor, the former NBC correspondent anchorman who was there. He was off on assignment, and she said, "Have you heard? The president has been shot." And I said, "They don't do that anymore." And she said, "Oh, yes, they have."
All right. Gary, you'll be back with us throughout the program. News updates, keep us up to the minute on the latest developments. Also with us this evening, as I mentioned, a terrorism expert and author of Terrorism in the Future of Terrorism, Harvey Kushner, and our senior CNN political correspondent, Jeff Greenfield. Jeff, you've had 5 days to cover this story. The emotions of day one are not the emotions or the feelings of day two. What's getting your attention now? Where are you focused?
How much more serious this is, I think, than anything in my lifetime. We lost a president. We mourned for 4 days. We had a new president. When I remember Lyndon Johnson bringing in the heads of state, it was very solemn. It was a very big signal that the government was going to go on. It affected people for years to come. You can argue it was a watershed moment, but there was no danger to the United States. The Vietnam War was ugly, divisive, tore the country apart in many ways, but it never put the United States physically at risk. And the Gulf War, as Garrick said, while it was serious and it was a big moment, as it turned out, blessedly, I think if it weren't for one lucky Scud hit, the deaths would have been in a few dozen.
Yeah, it was clean, and it was surgical, and it was short.
We knew where the enemy was. We knew what the goal was. Yeah. Saddam Hussein was not only a perfect villain, he had done a clearly villainous deed that threatened diplomatically, geopolitical interests, but did not threaten us, I mean, in the physical way. So you add up, you put these things on the table. Everything we thought about the world that we were going to be living in and that our kids were going to be living in has been put at least at risk. Mm-hmm. The thing that we never thought could happen, a massive, deadly assault here at home, which never happened in World War II. I mean, we see pictures of blackout curtains and air raid wardens walking through towns to make sure that there were no lights. The Japanese were not coming over here with their airplanes. I think there was a group of saboteurs, German saboteurs, that landed a submarine off Long Island. They were captured. They were executed within 6 weeks. We were not at risk in that sense. It was clear where the risk was. The risk was where your sons or fathers or husbands were over there, as the song had. Right. So when you put that on the table, and then, as I'm sure Harvey will get into with you, start talking about how you even define what the mission is. Yeah. Where is it? What constitutes victory? I mean, the hardest question I know how to ask about all this is how will we know when we've won? So I don't only think it ranks at the top in terms of story and effect, I think it's the most difficult situation this country's found itself in my lifetime.
In a couple of minutes, I want to ask you a question about whether or not we have the national resolve necessary to do the kind of nebulous, long-term, expensive things that are being talked about in Washington. Life's been good since the end of the Gulf War. The economy boomed. The Cold War ended. The Gulf War was won. And this nation has been not only at peace, but kind of living high on the hog. And all of a sudden, it changes just like that. And you wonder now whether we have the patience. We tend to be an impatient country, the strength, the intestinal fortitude. So think about that for a minute. Judy's on the phone from Connecticut. Judy, what do you want to bring up with us this evening? Are you there, Judy?
Hello, you there?
Hello. Yes, I'm here.
My comment is, do we have a government who is intelligent enough to do this now, do you think? What's your comment?
You don't want to know my comment. I'm just kind of here to preside over this thing. I don't know. I don't know if it's just a question that's fair to address to the government. I don't know if anybody's intelligent enough. I mean, we talk about going after terrorism. What does that mean? And where is it? And who is it? I mean, they're living here. They're living in 55 other nations. They're supported by state governments. What about that question?
Well, I'm just thinking of the questions you raised because of the title of David Halberstam's book on the men who led us to war in Vietnam. The Best and the Brightest. It was an ironic title. It was a title meant to convey his profound sense of disappointment and anger and even rage at the quality of the decisions. Those men were celebrated in Life magazine article by Theodore White, the man who wrote The Making of the President, as the action intellectuals. And then it turned out that these people, as smart as they were and as educated as they were, clearly some of those decisions were not the right ones. I think this question is on everybody's mind right now, even though when you look at them on paper, Colin Powell, Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, these are experienced folks. But what's the resume to fight a war like this?
And the parallel on Vietnam is not lost. We were fighting an enemy we didn't understand, we couldn't find, we didn't know exactly who they were. They were soldiers, they were women, they were kids, they were carts full of vegetables that had been booby-trapped. We didn't know how to go into those jungles and fight. And there are parallels, I suppose, with the kind of thing we're about to undertake here. Lauren in Florida, what's your question?
I just want to say that, I'm a native New Yorker, and I lost, right now, 2 cousins of mine are missing. And my husband and I, we both work for American.
We lost her. She said that she had 2 cousins that were missing. I think she was saying that she and her husband both work for American Airlines. The impact on the airlines, obviously, coming as a result of this is not insignificant. Continental has announced it's going to lay off 12,000 people. Midway Airlines suspending operations. I think 1,700 people are going to be out of work. And the cost estimates on money lost per day, something in the neighborhood of $250 to $300 million. One of our guests that we'll have on here in a couple of minutes, I heard her earlier in an interview talking about the fact that she wouldn't buy a ticket. She wouldn't get on an airplane now.
The other question you have to put on the table is the whole notion of locking the barn door, after the horses escaped. You understand fully the impulse to ratchet up security in the airlines, but as far as I can tell, none of the steps that have been taken would have stopped any of these hijackings. So, and you know that when you impose these levels of bureaucratic and logistical demands on an already overtaxed system, what you're going to get, and it may be a price we'll have to pay, is going to be massive. It's not just the inconvenience. It's not just having to check in 2 or 3 hours early. Right. But it's also what that's going to do to an already economically depressed airline. And then the question is, at what benefit in terms of security? Last night I had on a fellow who'd lived in Israel 30 years, a writer named Zev Chaffetz, who worked for the Begin government. He said, do you really think that if the terrorists plan to strike again, they're going to do the same thing they did before?
Of course.
So that's where you begin to ask yourself, But what point are these steps, which are taken out of security, out of caution, out of fear? It's not just a question of what's it going to do to us, but what are we going to get from it? And I actually think when you ask the question about patience and resolve, one of the real questions is going to be, when you add up all the costs of this, human and financial and logistical and burdensome, I don't know how you calculate it. I don't know how you do that. It's way more than money, and it's even more, it's, believe it or not, than 5,000 lives. The ripple effect of this, I think, is going to ultimately wind up affecting millions of people.
Is this a doable thing we're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. But if I may just for a moment, for almost myself, since it's happened, commenting, worldwide and answering questions, it's had a traumatic shock on my body. But hearing the discussion when you opened up, Jack, mentioning what events, in your past, in lifetime, were monumental, and each one mentioned certainly the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And but you're in the business to look at the news and to pick out and report to the general public. But somebody like myself, who spent his entire life almost studying just this day, this possibility, and then to see it happen, it's my greatest fears were visited. And so, unfortunately, I don't wish this upon America, but we were coming into an age where each one of you and everybody out there is going to have to think about it and give the thought that I have over 35 years in this business of studying the terrorist mindset and seeing what happened on the 11th. And that's the type of effort that's going to have to be launched in these United States. I consider myself a sane person. I consider myself able to focus in on what I love in the United States, our Constitution and our freedom of access, but yet my life is spent looking at just this possibility, and I think I'm traumatized by it, but I think if we all put our effort to it, sort of a Marshall Plan or a monumental approach to taking a look at what's going to happen, then we're going to solve it. If we're going to take the approach that was hinted before, this singular effort, this one-shot deal, firing some missiles in and then walking away from it, it's going to be over with, because the front is not just going to be outside the United States, gentlemen, but the front will be inside the United States. We're going to have a fifth column of subversive acts occurring here.
Like Jerusalem with the car bombings and the...
Absolutely, that's the
daily
that's
occurrence.
The next stage. I mean, Jeff mentioned it. Osama bin Laden himself has never considered the same thing twice. It's always ratcheted up. So the next thing might be somebody in Penn Station with 40 pounds of explosives pressing that button. Because make no mistake about it, you can't pull off a monumental effort like this unless you have support. Osama's not sitting in the Batcave in Afghanistan on his cell phone saying, you do this, you do that. Yep. His adherents are out here with a message beyond what he's already told them.
All right, we're going to get to Dave in California who's on the phone. Jeff, I know you've got a long day, and you've got Greenfield at large to look over, and you've got demands placed on you by other CNN programs. I thank you for helping us launch this, and I look forward to talking to you again on this program soon. Jeff Greenfield. Dave, in California, what can we do for you?
Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I actually had two questions. One is first about the military response, and then if I can, a second one about immigration. But I'm a 32.
Well, let's start with the military response question.
Okay, military response question. I'm a 32-year-old father of two here in California. My grandfathers fought in World War II. In fact, one was a B-17 pilot in Europe. You folks have mentioned the question about, do we have the intestinal fortitude for this? But yesterday I saw an interview with Norman Schwarzkopf about, and this question has been raised about ground troops. And I think the American people need to prepare themselves for the question of that this is going to take years. But here's my question. I've only heard phrases on the news of, well, U.S. hasn't ruled out any options. I'd like to hear from the experts if they think that if this does drag out years, would we consider, you've shown pictures in the last 10 minutes, bin Laden is literally and figuratively maybe under a rock. And would we consider the use of tactical battlefield nuclear weapons to end this in lieu of losing 50,000 United States and coalition and British and French and German forces? Because we better start talking about it now, because the question might arise 2 or 3 years from now. That's my question.
Well, it's a good question I'm not capable of answering. I suppose the question on top of the question is whether even in the case of someone who has dug into the degree that he apparently is, whether even tactical nuclear weapons would be effective. I mean, there is a school of thought that says the only way you get this guy is to go in and dig him out, get him out by hand. The other part of the story is, as the reading I've done, he's surrounded with people who are instructed to make him a martyr rather than allow him to be taken alive, so that in the event that the security around him is penetrated, his people have instructions to put a bullet in his head so that he becomes a martyr for the Islamic fundamentalists. But what about the question of nuclear weapons? And while we're on the subject, a country very much involved in this is Pakistan, and they have nuclear weapons.
Well, certainly at this stage, nothing's off the table. I mean, if you take the president literally smoking them out of their holes, that's what you would do with, with nuclear weapons. But there are geopolitical considerations that need to be discussed. First of all, you have the concept of Iran is in the area, and certainly Pakistan, and realize that when you launch a nuclear attack, you launch it against the world, you launch it against the atmosphere, and I don't know whether or not American citizens, certainly environmentalists, you don't want to get them up on something like this. So I think it would be serious to use a tactical nuclear weapon. I think there are other ways of dealing with this rather than the ultimate. That seems to me something that these people would think of using. And certainly Osama already thinks of himself as a dead man walking. He knows his life is numbered. So that's not a way to win this type of war.
What was the other question, Dave? You still there? All right, Calvin in Texas.
Yes, sir. I was just wondering, the FBI Most Wanted done so good and everything else, why can't we put their pictures and their faces up on the TV so we will know who they are? To where, like in Florida, they didn't know who they were, but the CIA and FBI were looking for them, but yet, we didn't know.
I'm
Why
not
can't
sure.
we put their picture up on the TV?
Calvin, I'm not sure that the identifications of these, if you're talking about the hijackers, I think those identifications were made after the fact, if the reading I've done is accurate. And prior to the event, we didn't know who they were. We obviously didn't know the event was even going to take place. But within a matter of hours, because apparently they left a trail that was fairly easy to follow, knowing that they were going to die in this thing, they did have IDs, and the names and the pictures were published shortly thereafter. I'm not sure they would have been able to publish the pictures of the people who did the crime before they knew the crime was going to happen, if you get my drift.
And Osama's picture is the most publicized in the world the last couple of years, and there's $5 million on his head, and he's #1 in the world. I don't think that that's going to do any good in this particular instance at all.
All right, why don't we bring our other guest into this, who is a woman who has had some very harsh things to say about the airline industry in this country. Mary Schiavo is a former Inspector General of the Department of Transportation. She has written a best-selling book entitled, and I had it written here, where is it? Flying Blind, Flying Safe. She joins us this evening from Columbus, Ohio. Mary, nice to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
If you got a call that you had to be in California in the next couple of days, would you go to the airport, buy a ticket, and get on a plane tonight to go?
No, already got that call and said no.
Why?
Well, because we had a rush to get everything, quote, back to normal, and the response has been very piecemeal. And Mr. Greenfield was absolutely right. The trouble is we've rushed to put in these stopgap measures. Many of these things we've done, we've tried before. It's piecemeal. We have the same security screeners that already allowed the breach, the breaches in the past. And this is kind of too little, too late. We're doing the same old thing, and the threat is much greater than that now. One of the things, for example, the FAA had many different terrorist scenarios on the table that they were worried about, and many of those aren't covered by the current security plan. So really, with the piecemeal reaction and the reaction to get things to normal, that's not really the response I want to see, because we are going to have a whole new way of looking at security. And people, I'm old enough to remember, I hope a lot of other Americans are, we didn't used to even have security in airports, and people complained about that. Oh, we have to go through metal detectors now, and oh, now we have to produce IDs, and oh, now we're going to have to answer these two ridiculous questions. We did it, and we all complied with it, and we got used to it, and now we have to build the airports for another threat. And I think that people saying, oh, this is going to destroy the airlines, they aren't really thinking very clearly about what we've been through.
Well, the airlines are well on their way to being destroyed by these events already. They were struggling under the weight of declining revenue, high fuel costs, just inimitable delays that were occurring. I remember particularly earlier in the spring and last winter, I mean, you couldn't get any place either out on time or arrive on time. I mean, the service was just atrocious.
That's right.
A lot of them are in financial trouble already. Now comes the total cost of this thing, the fact that airlines are cutting back. Let me talk to you, though, about security measures. I mean, it was almost as though people tried to keep from laughing out loud when one of the first things we heard after this was we weren't going to have curbside check-in anymore. Is it just me, or is there some absurdity hidden there?
That's right. There's this absurdity hidden there, and particularly, I mean, when people got to thinking about that, they realized that before, basically our terrorist check consisted of the skycaps asking us if we had packed our own bags, and the curbside check doesn't do anything to eliminate the kind of threat that we've just had or the additional threats that the FAA has considered in the past. And then the other thing that just really made us wonder if anyone in the FAA really flew is when they said they're going to ban steak knives off of airline meals. I really, I mean, I couldn't laugh because this is so tragic, but I really wondered who's in charge.
The other thing, as I understand it, airline security, it's sort of been up to the airlines up to this point. Is that true? And it was up to them to pay for it. Now, the other thing that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, not exactly. We have a piecemeal plan. The way it works is the FAA asks each airline to submit their security plan and each airport to submit their security plan, and then the FAA will approve them, and then the airline and the airport then contract out the security function to the lowest bidder. So it's, 1,000 different plans with, 1,000 different ideas how to meet it. And we have, what we have done over the past, though, is pay ticket taxes and facility charges, et cetera, that went into the Aviation Trust Fund, which was supposed to be for aviation safety and security, but we use it for things like, the nice concourses in the airport and the stores and the parking lots.
Also, the quality of the personnel themselves and how carefully they're screened and how much they're paid, and based on the compensation, the kind of individual you can attract to do that kind of work. What ought to be done with who's guarding the airports and the boarding gates now? Who ought to be doing it? How much ought they be paid? Who should do the screening? Who should take over the supervision of the airport security system in this country? The FAA doesn't seem to have done a bang-up job here.
Well, you're exactly right, and we are one of the few nations in the world that allow our airport security, which is our national security, to be literally run by a civilian contracting out agency. In most other countries, airport security is considered national security and is either run by federal law enforcement authorities or by the military. And in this case, I think that's really the only long-range viable option we have. Now, I have heard suggestions that the FAA will take back over the security function, but what really is the difference if the FAA contracts out to these low-paid screeners or if the airlines do? I think we need our own national airport security force, and in the meantime, there are ways we could handle that with current forces, but the long run, this is never going to work. It has not worked for 10 years. We had these same warnings and fears after Pan Am 103. We had these same warnings and fears and these same measures during Desert Storm, and people forget that these suggestions have been on the table for years, and we've had very real tragedies before, and we have not changed.
All right. As we move forward, some other things I'd like to talk to you about in the next hour and a half or so, things like cockpit security and why El Al, the Israeli airline, doesn't have these kinds of problems, and what a transponder is, and how come they can be turned off, and other things that I'm sure you won't have a problem with. Let's talk to Barbara in California. She has a question. Barbara?
Yes, I do have a question, but I also have a certain amount of resentment about the idea that only people of faith can join a prayer and remembrance service with President Bush. I am an atheist, and I believe there are many, many patriots who are also atheists. I am a person who believes in reason and the rule of law, and I think that that's what our founding fathers gave us. They didn't give us a religion. They gave us freedom from religion, actually, if we choose it. And I think
that's a fair comment.
I think reason will eventually prevail if we give it a chance, and I believe there's a lot of discussion going on in the government, which is reasonable. So I think we should not become fanatics to fight fanatics.
All right, Barbara, thank you for your comments. Who's next on the telephone? Susan from Indiana, what can we do for you? Or what can you do for us, maybe is a better way to say that. All right. Let me go back to Mary Schiavo. El Al Airlines has the best security in the world. Why?
Well, because they take the threat very seriously, and they have learned from very, very serious tragedies. And of course, others will point out because they are small. They also tend to be very expensive. What they do is they hand search all the luggage. They know what's going on to the plane. You get asked many, many questions, not did you pack your own bag. And by the way, other carriers and other airports do that too. Several European airlines and airports question you in depth when you're traveling and do much greater security screening. But El Al also has literally fortified planes, hardened luggage containers. They have a double door to the cockpit. So, people are talking about putting an absolute fail-safe locked cockpit door for the flight deck and the flight personnel. But on a long flight, obviously, they're going to come out for human reasons. So El Al has solved that with a double door. The pilots can come out and use the restroom facilities, and there's still another door between them and the cockpit. But that won't do it alone. You also have to have the policies that go along with that, because even a double locked door, a pilot who has the responsibility for the safety and well-being of everyone on that plane, at least in our country, we're blessed with pilots who, care enough about their passengers to come out. We will have to have policies that say you can't come out. So the locked door may not solve that entirely either, but El Al just goes, to great lengths to secure the passengers.
And nobody's hijacked one of those in a long time, have they, if ever?
No, but then they learned from some terrible tragedies. Sure. And decided simply to make their people safe. Literally, if we opened up an El Al airline tomorrow, the airline would be flush with business. Not that Americans want to give up flying. We are a nation of flying. We conduct our business on the airplane. I mean, some of us work in 3 locations across the country. And this is difficult on everyone, but people don't feel safe. And if you want to save the airlines, the best thing you can do for the airlines is make it safe. So the objections to the cost and the delays are actually very counterproductive to the carriers. If we made them safe, it would be a much better situation for them in the long run. Much better.
More to come with Mary Schiavo, who's former Department of Transportation Inspector General. It's 12:32 in the East, and time to get caught up on the very latest news developments in connection with all this. Here's Gary Cutley.
Thanks, Jack. Well, now a second person is being held as a material witness in connection with Tuesday's terrorist attacks. The man had been held by U.S. Immigration Services, and he's been questioned thoroughly, no doubt, by the FBI. Another development on Saturday, New York officials revealed at a news conference here in the city that a hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site, if you can believe that. No other details were given, but the discovery prompted the FBI and police to expand the search area down in Lower Manhattan. President George W. Bush has been meeting with key advisors at Camp David in the Maryland mountains, and he is warning the American public, quote, as we know now, we are at war, unquote. He labeled Osama bin Laden as the top suspect in the attacks, and he's told the military, he's given the military a simple order, get ready. And in New York City, the number of people believed buried under the ruins has now been raised to nearly 5,000, but the digging, the searching, the hoping continues. Mayor Rudy Giuliani says he is holding out only slight hope that survivors can still be found. On Saturday, as on Friday, as on Thursday, nobody was. Only 159 bodies of those nearly 5,000 have been recovered, and at the Pentagon, 187 people are missing, and they are presumed lost. Funerals are beginning now, 4 days after the attacks. And mourners gathered Saturday as New York buried 3 of its top fire department officials. Up to 300 firefighters are believed to have died in the city. And slowly, as far as air transport is concerned, air travel is resuming across the land. Boston's Logan Airport, where 2 of Tuesday's planes took off, reopened on Saturday. The 3 major airports in the New York City area are operating, but very sharply reduced capacities. John F. Kennedy Airport, LaGuardia, and Newark International resumed services on Friday. One airliner that was hijacked on Tuesday, of course, took off from Newark across the river from Manhattan here. Well, Tuesday's hijackings turned airplanes into flying bombs. Perhaps that was the perverted genius of the terrorists. And now a group representing the people who fly those planes is advising its members to take a firm stand. Here's Gene Meserve.
For pilots, the rule of thumb in hijackings has always been be passive, be cooperative, get on the ground and into negotiations. Tuesday, the rules changed instantaneously. Commercial pilot Paul Emmons was in the air.
And my co-pilot and I basically looked at each other and said, "You want to fly or fight?" And he had his big steel flashlight, and if anybody came through the door, he was going to go after him, and I was going to get the airplane on the ground.
According to the Airline Pilots Association, pilots and flight attendants, the airlines, the FAA, and law enforcement are engaged in an unprecedented cooperative effort to improve aircraft security quickly.
We are at war, and we're treating it that way, and everybody's cutting through the red tape, making decisions.
Among the changes being considered on an expedited basis, whether to provide law enforcement escorts, whether to arm pilots with weapons, and how to modify equipment like the cockpit door so it is a more effective barrier.
This new door that we want well, I hope by Friday, really by Friday, I want a certification process approved by the FAA and the manufacturer in ALPA, and I believe we can have that, and then on our way to getting that door.
Some airlines have told their pilots to do what they must to save themselves, their aircraft, and their passengers. Pilot Paul Emmons says if his plane is under threat, passengers better hold on.
You should be wearing your seatbelt.
What does that mean?
We can start to maneuver that aircraft so that he cannot function.
Depressurize?
We can depressurize the aircraft, we can throw it around the sky, we can do all sorts of things, and he won't be walking when it's over.
Despite the financial distress of the airline industry, the Airline Pilots Association says no security measure is off the table, no matter what the expense. But some aviation watchdogs are critical. They say the problems and the solutions were known long ago, and they ask, why are we seeing corrections so late? Too late. Jean Meserve, CNN, Washington.
And Jack, a moment ago you were talking about the impossibility of knowing who these terrorists are before the terrorist act is actually carried out, which is not
exactly right.
Not totally true. CNN is reporting now that two of the suspects of these terrorist attacks were on a watch list. These are lists that U.S. intelligence puts together, and these are what you're supposed to keep your eyes on. And indeed, one of them was actually under surveillance, picked up by a surveillance camera when he was meeting in Kuala Lumpur. That's in Malaysia, Southeast Asia, a long trip to take.
Right.
Meeting with a person who is suspected to have been involved in the bombing of the USS Cole, which killed 17 Navy men and women. So the fact is there is a watch list out there. Sometimes these names are known. The question is, can you follow them 24 hours a day?
You know, years ago, you remember when Carmine Galante was killed here in New York City, and he was shot down in the courtyard of a restaurant in Brooklyn, and I was working at local news at Channel 4 at the time, and we raced to the scene, and we got this live remote up, and he too was being followed. He'd just gotten out of prison, and the FBI was trailing him, and he was under surveillance, and of course his enemies got him anyway in the courtyard of this restaurant. So I'm doing a live remote with Chuck Scarborough, who's the anchor at Channel 4 in New York, back at the studio, and when I get all finished, we were live on the air, and Chuck said, well, if the FBI was watching him, why was he killed?
Well, this is the good question. The answer, obviously, is that there are so many of these suspects out there. How much manpower do you have? And are they now going to authorize and budget the manpower and the effort to track all of these people?
It's not only the list. It's communication between these federal agencies, between themselves. I mean, we've seen cases here in this country where Customs had one guy, couldn't communicate to the FBI. We saw it in one of these serial killers a couple of months back. So it's the communication between these thousands of people who are being watched, who enter the country each day, and whether the FBI gets the information out to local law enforcement, and that's a major problem. You know, one thing we failed to realize here, we're going to be fighting on a front inside this country, and we're going to have to use the military in a different way than we ever used before.
I mean,
in a sense, think about this, you know, posse comitatus. You know, if you're going to fight a war against terrorism, you have a front inside the United States. You actually have these cells operating here, not just 5 years, back as much as 15 years ago. They've set up shop in this country. And you're going to have a concerted effort by law enforcement. You've got 50,000 different law enforcement agencies. How do you coordinate that effort? You're going to need one agency to do this. I think a federal agency, you need some military manpower. This might have us rethink the use of military assets, both outside the country and inside the country.
Gary in Missouri, what can we do for you?
How are you this evening?
I'm good. Are they still charging $5 a gallon for gasoline out there? I heard some ugly stories. I used to work in Kansas City years ago, and I heard that within hours after this happened, there were some opportunists that jacked up the price of the pump to $4 and $5. That's not still going on, is it?
University of Missouri lost, so it brought them right back into check real quick.
Okay, good. What can we help you with?
I guess my concern and my next question is, I did several years in the United States Navy. I see that there is a big concern as regards to the commercial airline safety. What are we doing in regards to private airlines? I just think of myself here in St. Charles, Missouri. There's several different private airlines. It's very accessible to Cessna aircraft and other smaller aircraft. What are we doing about those?
Little airports all over the country, that's a good point, that contain virtually unwatched aircraft that are sitting tethered. You hop a fence, and if you know what you're doing, you can be airborne in 10 minutes. What about that?
Very little watching going on. I mean, even during the Persian Gulf War, I myself went to one of those private aircraft out on Long Island, walked right on the tarmac, got on a plane. I mean, so, you know, again, there's, what, 400 or some odd airports in the United States. How do we ratchet up security with the system that's not working now? How do you put extra layers on that, you know? It's an absurd system that we have, and I think Mary said it before, and I would go one step further. I think we must develop a federal force. You know, somebody that watches our borders also has to watch the people go in. I don't think
that's all immigration policies.
Yeah, but I don't think the FAA hasn't shown any ability to do this. They've been more puffing the airlines rather than watching them. I think you need some agency like the United States Customs. It's not a plug for Customs.
What about Customs or the Coast Guard, Mary? Do either of those make any sense?
They both make sense, and I was actually very fortunate to work with both of them when I worked aviation crimes as the Inspector General. The Customs was a very reliable law enforcement counterpart when we worked international cases on bogus parts and other aviation crimes. But I'm rather partial to the Coast Guard for a couple very real reasons. The Coast Guard is in the Department of Transportation, so it would provide seamless transportation coverage. And the Coast Guard already has jurisdiction over the ports, and most airports are ports. In fact, you know, Port of New York, New Jersey, Port Columbus, etc. And they are trained, they're already trained in law enforcement. Many of them are trained in drug interdiction. They have a fleet of aircraft. They are very experienced in overwater operations. They already do our aircraft down in water search and rescue. They're very familiar with the rules. And the most important thing about the Coast Guard is they're already used to dealing with the transportation public because they're responsible for the oversight, enforcement, and law enforcement against bad boaters and protecting boaters, which outnumber pilots and aircraft. So they're extremely experienced, and you know, they can do an amazing job with very little. I'm very high on the Coast Guard.
All right, good. Mary, we'll get back to you in a moment. What I'd like to do, if we can, Gary Tuchman has been reporting all day today and all night tonight on the ongoing search and rescue, which are rapidly becoming search and recovery efforts going on at what we have dubbed Ground Zero of the news media. This is where the World Trade Center came down. The pictures you see on television, we'll switch to Gary here in just a moment, don't really I think begin to tell the story of the size, the dimension of the rubble removal task that is faced by the city of New York. As of this afternoon, the city had removed about 13,000 tons of rubble from the World Trade Center site. That's less than 1%. The World Trade Center, 110 stories tall, contained, these are staggering numbers, 200,000 tons of steel, 425,000 cubic yards of concrete, and 14 acres of windows. So let's get an update from Gary Tuchman at Ground Zero in downtown New York on what's going on down there tonight, and perhaps more importantly, how the spirit and resolve of these dedicated people is holding up. Gary?
Jack, I'll tell you, when you talk about spirit and resolve, the people who have been working here have it in abundance. But the problem is they've had absolutely no good news over the last 3 days. A few survivors were found on Tuesday, a few on Wednesday. Since then, not one survivor has been found. Behind me, you can see the smoke is still billowing. It's billowing because the fires continue to break out. They put out a fire in one place, then they remove steel in another place that provides oxygen to that area, and another fire breaks out. So you see the situation there. It's still very dangerous for the rescue workers, and they have no good news to tell over the last 3 days. They're still hopeful there could possibly be survivors, but they haven't found any for more than 72 hours. Jack?
And isn't the conventional wisdom, Gary, that in a situation like this, the first 48 hours is absolutely critical, and after that the survival rate drops off to almost nothing?
Survival rate drops down very low, but there certainly is precedent for finding people a week or two later from earthquakes all over the world. But there's also precedent to show that it's unlikely, in the sense that during the Oklahoma City disaster, they were hopeful they would find survivors, and they did the day of, they did the day after, and nobody after that.
All right, Gary Tuchman at Ground Zero. The list of the missing and people who are expected at some point they will recover their bodies and identify them is approaching 5,000. Maybe it's worth thinking about for a moment that the World Trade Center, the capacity of those two buildings was 50,000. And that oftentimes during the summertime they would have things like concerts, they would have entertainment in the plaza area down around the World Trade Center. And I guess what I'm trying to get at here, and it's tough to put any kind of positive spin on this, but it's conceivable that not just the 40, 50,000 in the World Trade Center might have been lost, but an additional how many thousand on the ground. And if those buildings had collapsed in a different way, if they had tipped instead of simply imploding and dropping almost straight down, all the buildings around them could have been at risk. So the potential loss of life, while 5,000 is certainly a horrible situation, the potential loss of life could have been much, much higher. And then when you think about the fact that this time those planes didn't have nuclear weapons, they didn't have chemical weapons, they didn't have biological weapons, but if you think these folks are going to not use those if and when they get their hands on them, I would guess you have another thing coming. It's a matter of time. That'll be next.
You know, and back in '93, Ramzi Yousef calculated that one would topple into the other.
Right.
And they were thinking in terms of what you're saying of 250,000 potential casualties. And at that time, he put cyanide gas right at ground at B2 level, but the heat of the explosion evaporated it. This time, I would imagine the planes were timed to come in almost simultaneously and take both towers down exactly in that same scenario. But you know, the chilling thing is when Ramzi Yousef was being brought back from Pakistan on the plane to the federal marshal, he looked out over as they came over the trade towers, and he said, if I had a bit more time and a little more money, I could have done the correct job. And then to see it come down, you know, and quite frankly, I worked on the civil litigation on that case with a couple of plaintiffs, and there were reports that the Port Authority had as far back as '88 pinpointing that level. And at that time, they felt they didn't want to stop public access. It would be too chilling to the economy of the area. But this is a telltale sign of what a terrorist will go to wreak havoc in our society.
John's on the phone in Texas. John?
Yeah, hello. I'm in the military at Fort Hood, Texas, with the 4th Infantry Division Mechanized. And I'm a little concerned about our current situation. I know that the weeks prior to this incident, they were actually contemplating reducing by 2 divisions the Army, and I'm not sure what the thought is on that now. But I know that the Army is severely undermanned right now. My platoon is an entire tank crew down. We have one tank that's just sitting in the motor pool without a crew. We're waiting for NCOs right now. The majority of our gunners are E3s and below, which they should be E5s and below. And I notice that people want that instant gratification. They want us to go out there and kick some butt. But I think we really have to sit back and be prudent and think about what we have to do. We have to reorganize. And 4th ID is the new Force 21. They're using the new M1A2 SEP tanks. It's all pretty new. And a lot of stuff, there's a lot of kinks that need to be worked out.
All right, John, there was some debate, obviously, between the administration and members of Congress about funding for the Defense Department military spending. In a matter of hours after this happened, the Congress appropriated, I think, $40 billion as a down payment on the funds needed to do this. Your point about being patient is a good one. It's going to take some time to plan this and to define the targets and mount the plans for the operations. And my guess is, and it's just a guess, but I've been covering news for a number of years, that you will see a lot of resources poured into the military in very short order, and we just hope when it's time that you guys can get the job done and all get home safely. Nice to have you on the program with us. We have Steve Harrington, who's a CNN reporter in northern Afghanistan, and he is joining us now. Harrigan? Steve Harrigan, can you hear me?
Yes. I can hear you fine, Jack.
What's the latest over there? What can you tell us? We're hearing all sorts of scary warnings coming out of the Taliban, the Afghani leadership. The last report I heard, they are in hiding. Give us an update on the situation there, if you can.
Sure. Jack, we're in northern Afghanistan. That's the part of the country, about 5 to 10%, that's still under control by Afghans who are in opposition to the Taliban. So these people here want to fight against the Taliban, and they are welcoming, even calling for U.S. military action against the Taliban. They want to take part in that fight. What's happened here today, the reason we're here now is they've just buried their top commander, Ahmed Shah Massoud. Now, he might not be familiar to many of your listeners, but he was the top commander here of the opposition, and he was assassinated immediately before those terrorist attacks in the United States. So the opposition here sees a clear link, an attempt by the Taliban to knock out the opposition here before going ahead with those terrorist attacks in the United States. But people here now in the opposition are standing firm. They say they want to fight. We've just seen a very emotional funeral when they buried their top commander, Massoud. They carried the body out of a helicopter by hand, people wailing, villagers here from northern Afghanistan lining the road. It's a very emotional scene as they've laid to rest their top commander, Shah Massoud. Jack?
What kind of numbers and what kinds of resources do they have, Steve?
As far as regular fighters go, the Northern Alliance says to have about 15,000 fighters, trained fighters, and perhaps about 15,000 more irregular fighters. And as you know, they've been battling the Taliban for about 5 years now. They've been driven back here into one of the most remote regions on Earth. We're giving you this live shot now without electricity. We're in a mountain range. It's a very difficult place to get to, but we've seen men armed with Kalashnikovs, the very same Kalashnikovs they fought against the Soviet Union with. And they're hoping that this crisis could be an opportunity for them to move against the Taliban. They say contacts so far with the United States have been minimal, but they hope to use their experience, to put that experience to work in working against the Taliban.
Do they expect the United States to fund whatever operation they have in mind?
They're hoping and calling for aid and to fight together. The question really is, how firm an alliance is this Northern Alliance? We've seen in the past a lot of squabbling between top commanders, and now their very top man has just been assassinated. So can they hold together as a fighting force? That's the real test.
All right, thanks, Steve, very much. Steve Harrigan reporting live from northern Afghanistan. Is that a formidable and significant opposition force that he's talking about over there?
I don't think so. I think the Taliban has Afghanistan wrapped up, and you know, I wonder why is all this interest in finding a state sponsorship of a terrorist organization to enact the War Act, when in fact the Taliban gives him cover, they give him logistics, they give him support, they give him free reign for money raised by the poppy trade. I mean, it's clear to me that they're a terrorist supporting state. I just cannot understand the logic of commentators and politicians not to see that clearly. I mean, it's harder to make a case against Iraq, certainly Syria, Iran, but,
sure.
But clearly, if there's an arrest warrant out for this man, and giving him shelter, they're housing him, and they deny that he is capable of even doing this. So it seems to me that it boggles the mind that in a modern era, why we don't consider this state sponsorship of terrorism.
That's the very thing President Bush was talking about. And
Yeah.
Colin Powell went to great lengths to talk about over and over in the early briefings in the day or two after this happened, that states that sponsor these people, harbor them, fund them, protect them in any way, are as guilty and as liable for retaliation as the terrorists themselves.
But that seems like the perfect model of this behavior. I don't understand why we're not ready to say, other than it's just one of a pariah state, that it is a state sponsorship of terrorism.
Let's bring in Major Garrett, who's live at the White House this evening, and get the latest from him on what's going on down there, and perhaps he can address what he may have heard concerning the subject of a possible declaration of war at some point in the future. Major Garrett, nice to have you with us.
Good to be with you, Jack. To take on the point that Harvey was just making, it's very clear, talking to senior administration officials, that when the president said, the first time a president has ever said on Tuesday, that not only will the United States hold accountable those who were directly responsible for the terrorist acts, but states that provided them shelter or aid and comfort. No one around here is calling that a Bush doctrine, but it is a significant change in U.S. policy, and the president has gradually, with his rhetoric and with what he asked Congress to approve as an act of providing him the legal authority to use force, is trying to turn the American people from traditional definitions of war fighting against nation states, against nations with borders, as he said in his radio address today, a battle with beachheads, to one that is of entirely greater, more complexity, and saying it's not going to be just one place, it's not going to be just one agent of terror, but the United States is going to try to hold and will do everything in its power to hold accountable multiple sources of this, what the President has often described as evil. And in the use of force resolution the Congress approved almost unanimously, one dissenting vote from one House Democrat from California, the Congress has embraced that new notion of warfare, that it is not just the perpetrators, the direct perpetrators of an act, but any other nations that may have provided aid and comfort. It is a significant shift in not only U.S. policy, but in the way the United States is going to act within the confines of international law. And I think you're seeing and have seen over the days the President trying to explain this to the American public. Things are moving so rapidly that it is even hard at times to fathom these changes, but I think the President is trying to work the country through it and to communicate as best he can this shift, moving away from the traditional understanding of warfare and the concepts, geographical and otherwise, of warfare to one that has many, many more layers, a higher degree of complexity.
Mike in Ohio, be patient. You're coming up in just a minute. Major Garrett, though, before we leave you, what's the difference between a resolution authorizing the use of force and a declaration of war?
Well, minimal, actually. I mean, it is now clear, and the President, of course, had the constitutional right to respond militarily to this attack on the United States without a use of force resolution coming from Congress. But he sought it for one very strategic, political, and constitutional reason. So there would be absolutely no question that all legal authority was placed in his hands to respond to this act of terror committed against the United States. The President has said, we are at war. He said so today at Camp David. He has made it clear in days before. This was an act of war. We have been attacked. We will now prosecute a war against terrorism. And now he has the full and complete legal authority to do so, given to him by a nearly unanimous Congress. It's worth pointing out that the last time Congress debated a use of force resolution, the reaction and the ultimate vote was much narrower. You'll recall in the United States Senate, his father, President George Herbert Walker Bush, received support of Congress by a vote of 52 to 48 to prosecute the war against Saddam Hussein and liberate Kuwait. There is no such ambiguity now, and the President knows it, and he intends to carry that lack of ambiguity forward on the international stage, prosecuting this war. Jack?
Major Garrett, live in Washington, thank you. As we move forward, it's at 12:57 Eastern Daylight Time. You were talking about states that harbor and sponsor terrorism, Harvey Kirshner. This gets a little tricky, doesn't it? I mean, the obvious ones like Iraq and Afghanistan and perhaps Yemen and the Sudan and places like that, that's one kettle of fish. What about places like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Iran and Afghanistan, who have we have requested certain concessions and cooperative efforts from? I mean, you could make the argument that some of Osama bin Laden's troops have been educated in those Islamic fundamentalist schools inside Pakistan. I mean, their hands aren't clean in any of this. How do you sort out? I mean, is it a black and white issue? They've seemed to create the impression that it is. You're either with us or you're against us. If you sponsor terrorism or harbor them or grant safe haven to them, you're our enemy. But are they all really?
Well, that's just it. That's the ambiguity in that region of the world. I mean, you mentioned, let's take Egypt, for example. Right. Certainly in this particular operation, I would imagine that some of these suicide bombers might have come from Egypt and might have gotten some training inside there as well. But the Egyptian government under Mubarak really is under siege by terrorism itself. He's looked to be toppled at any given time. So I don't think the spirit of the Egyptian government really is to support terrorist actions against these United States, whereas other states that you mentioned, Iran, certainly Iraq, questionable. Syria
I mean,
and others.
Syria is a perfect example.
Well, they do. They supported, certainly in the Lebanon and the training camps
Of course,
there.
the Bekaa Valley is
Absolutely,
full of terrorists.
and they used the drug money from the Bekaa Valley to finance this.
And the leader's father, Assad's dad,
That's correct.
ran this whole operation for years.
Jack.
Now the son has come out with this statement. I mean, can you believe what these people say? The son issued a statement, was it yesterday or the day before? We deplore these acts, we deplore terror, and blah, 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 blah.
That's the problem. That's the problem we face, the ambiguity of who the enemy is. It
Sure.
seems that the structure that's been set up worldwide, and especially in the United States, has this ambiguous and sometimes specific support of these actions. You know, it's important to state over and over again that if we take out Osama bin Laden, the problem is not going to go away. There are
one
other
guy.
people who are going to step up to the plate. The same thing in a drug trade. It's because you have people who are willing to die for that particular cause.
Right.
And there are a significant number in that region of the world and here in the United States.